Malenia, blade of Miquella, never lost a battle. She was the greatest warrior in the lands between, undefeated, unmatched. A goddess of war who moved like golden light. But she lost everything that mattered. She lost her body to rot. She lost her brother to betrayal. She lost her soul to a curse she never asked for. By the time you fight her at the roots of the Halig tree, she's already been defeated. Not by a sword, not by an army, but by life itself. This is the complete tragic story of Malenia, blade of Miquella, the warrior who was born cursed, lived in agony, and died defending a dream that was never hers. If you've ever wondered why she's called the hardest boss in gaming history, it's because her life was the hardest fight anyone could ever endure. This is her story. Make sure you subscribe if you want more deep Elden Ring lore. Malenia and her twin brother, Miquella, were born to Queen Marika and her second husband, Radagon. Their birth was a unique event in the history of the lands between, because Marika and Radagon were actually two halves of the same divine being. The twins were born of a single god. This lineage granted them immense power from the start. They were both chosen as Empyreans. This meant they possessed the potential to succeed Marika and become the next god of a new age. They were the crown jewels of the Golden Order, meant to represent the perfection of their parents' union. However, this divine incest came with a terrible price. The laws of nature seem to have recoiled at the union of a single being. As a result, both children were born with permanent biological afflictions. These were not mere illnesses. They were fundamental instabilities that defined their entire existence. While Miquella was cursed with eternal childhood, Malenia was born with a much more violent condition. She was infested from birth with a spiritual parasite. This instability was the foundation of their lives. It turned their status as prodigies into a lifelong struggle for survival. The twin prodigies were inseparable throughout their youth. Their relationship was built on a shared understanding of their broken nature. They were the only ones who truly knew the weight of carrying a divine burden that was also a death sentence. Miquella devoted his legendary mind to finding a cure for his sister. Malenia devoted her growing strength to being his shield. They were two halves of a whole, much like their parents. But where their parents sought power and totality, the twins sought only to fix what was broken within themselves. Their status as Empyreans also meant they were targets for the outer gods. These cosmic entities saw the twins as perfect vessels for their own influence. The instability of their birth made them vulnerable. It opened a door that should have remained closed. Malenia was not just a princess. She was a battlefield. The forces of the cosmos were fighting over her flesh before she could even walk. This reality shaped her into a warrior. She had to learn to fight the internal enemy long before she ever picked up a blade. The story of the twin prodigies is the beginning of the end for the Golden Order. Their birth proved that Marika's system was reaching its limit. Even a god could not create life from themselves without consequences. Malenia and Miquella were the physical proof of this failure. They were beautiful, powerful, and deeply flawed. Their lives would eventually lead them far away from the Erd Tree. They sought a new path that could accommodate their broken bodies. But that path started in the shadow of their parents' singular, divine ego. From the very first moment of her life, Malenia was infested with the Scarlet Rot. This was not a mundane infection or a simple disease of the blood. It was a parasitic presence from an outer god of rot. This entity saw Malenia as its chosen vessel on Earth. It wanted to use her body as a garden for a cosmic cycle of decay, while her brother remained a child forever. Malenia was being eaten alive from the inside out. Her flesh was not her own. It was a host for a fungus that sought to bloom and consume the world. The Scarlet Rot is a force of absolute stagnation. It represents the end of the cycle of life and rebirth. In the Golden Order, everything is meant to return to the Erd Tree. The Rot ignores this law. It creates its own cycle of fungal rebirth. Malenia had to live with the constant, agonizing sensation of her own body dissolving. Every day was a battle against the encroachment of the red mold. She was a living martyr for a god she never asked to serve. The Rot was her constant companion, a shadow that she could never outrun. This curse defined Malenia's personality. She grew up knowing that her time was limited and that her body was a weapon aimed at the world. She had to develop an incredible level of mental fortitude to keep from hollowing. The Rot did not just target her limbs, it targeted her mind. It whispered of surrender and the beauty of decay. Malenia had to build a wall of iron around her soul. She refused to become the monster the outer god wanted her to be. This resistance is what made her the greatest warrior in history. The Rot eventually took a heavy physical toll. It consumed her right arm and both of her legs. It took her eyes and left her in a world of darkness. But Malenia did not stop. She replaced her lost parts with gold and kept moving. Her struggle against the Rot was a rejection of the idea that she was just a vessel. She wanted to be Malenia, not the goddess of Rot. This internal war was much more difficult than any battle she would later fight in the Shattering. It was a silent, hourly struggle against a divine infection that wanted her to bloom. Malenia's curse is the central tragedy of her character. She was born with the potential to be a perfect god, but she was given a body that was a rotting corpse. Everything she achieved was a victory over her own biology. She was a woman who lived in constant pain, yet she never complained. She focused all of her energy on her brother and his dream of a better world. She used her Rot as a source of strength, turning her suffering into a lethal combat style. But the Rot was patient. It was waiting for the moment when her will would finally break. By the time she reached early adulthood, the Scarlet Rot had claimed a devastating portion of Malenia's body. She had lost her right arm and both of her legs to the spreading decay. The infection had also taken her sight, leaving her blind and in a state of near constant agony. To the rest of the world, she appeared as a dying princess. She was a broken Empyrean who would never reach her potential. But Miquella refused to accept this fate. He abandoned the Golden Order and its failed miracles. He turned his genius toward the creation of unalloyed gold. Miquella crafted prosthetics made of this pure, unalloyed metal. These were not just simple replacements for her limbs. They were sophisticated mechanical seals. The unalloyed gold was designed specifically to ward off the influence of outer gods. By attaching these limbs to her body, Miquella was creating a physical barrier against the Rot. The metal didn't just allow her to walk and fight. It acted as a lock on the parasite within her. It suppressed the god of Rot and gave Malenia her sanity back. It was a miracle of science and love. The prosthetics allowed Malenia to become a warrior once again. She learned to use her golden arm with a precision that surpassed her natural limbs. The metal became an extension of her soul. It was a symbol of her brother's devotion and her own refusal to yield. These golden seals were the only thing standing between Malenia and a total fungal transformation. As long as the gold remained intact, she was in control. She was the Blade of Miquella, a title she wore with more pride than her own name. However, the use of unalloyed gold was a declaration of war against the heavens. By creating a metal that could block the influence of the gods, Miquella was challenging the entire structure of the universe. Malenia was the living test case for this rebellion. Her golden limbs were a constant reminder that the twins did not need the Erd Tree's grace to survive. They had found their own way, but this independence made them targets. The Golden Order saw their work as heresy. The god of Rot saw it as a temporary delay. The loss of her limbs was the moment Malenia shed her childhood and became a weapon. She accepted the gold and the burden that came with it. She knew that her life was a gift from her brother, and she intended to use that gift to protect him. The prosthetics were a cage for the Rot, but they were also the foundation of her martial legend. She was a woman of wood and gold, a blind swordswoman who could outrun the wind. The gold was her salvation, but it was also a fragile shield. It required absolute discipline to maintain the seal. Malenia's legendary fighting style was not something she was born with. It was shaped by her meeting with a mysterious figure known as the Blind Swordsman. This warrior was a legend from the distant past. He was the man who had once sealed the god of Rot in the Lake of Rot. He achieved this feat using a technique that mimicked the movement of flowing water. He believed that stagnation was the source of all decay, and that flowing water was the only thing that could stay pure. This philosophy was exactly what Malenia needed to survive her internal curse. The meeting between the princess and the swordsman was a turning point in her life. Whether he was a ghost or a traveler from a distant land, his impact was absolute. He saw the rot within Malenia and understood that she could not fight it with brute force. He taught her that the rot was like a stagnant pond. To resist it, she had to become like a river. She had to keep her mind and her body in a constant state of flow. By adopting this philosophy, Malenia found a way to prevent the rot from taking root in her mind. The blind swordsman's teachings were both physical and spiritual. He taught her to fight without sight, relying on the rhythm of the world around her. He taught her that a blade should never be static. It should always be moving, always transitioning from one strike to the next. This fluid style was the perfect counter to the heavy, crushing weight of the Scarlet Rot. Malenia adopted the swordsman as her mentor, and his influence shaped her entire identity. She was no longer just a cursed princess. She was a practitioner of the flowing water. This connection between the swordsman and the rot is deep lore. The Blue Dancer charm tells of a fairy who gave the swordsman a blade of flowing water. This fairy was likely a representative of the ancient forces of the earth that opposed the outer gods. By following this path, Malenia was tapping into a power that was older than the Erd Tree. She was using the earth's own defenses to fight the parasite in her blood. The swordsman gave her more than a technique. He gave her a psychological armor that allowed her to live a productive life despite her terminal illness. Malenia's identity as a warrior is entirely built on this meeting. She kept her sword moving to keep her soul from rotting. The flowing water was her meditation. It was the only time she felt truly free from the influence of the outer god. As long as she was in the dance of combat, the rot was silenced. She became a blur of golden light, a woman who moved with the grace of a waterfall. The blind swordsman had given the blade of Miquella her edge. He taught her how to turn a curse into a dance. Under the guidance of the blind swordsman, Malenia refined her skills until she developed a combat style that was unlike anything seen in the lands between. This style reached its absolute peak in the waterfowl dance. This technique is a flurry of blade strikes delivered with such incredible speed that the sword appears as a blur of golden light. It mimics the chaotic but purposeful flow of a river crashing over rocks. For Malenia, this dance was her ultimate defensive move. It was a physical manifestation of the philosophy that movement is the only cure for stagnation. Mastering the dance required Malenia to achieve a state of perfect harmony with her golden prosthetics. She had to learn to balance her weight on her metal legs and strike with her golden arm without thinking. The technique relies on constant rotation and airtime, keeping the fighter in a state of perpetual motion. To an observer, it looks like a beautiful, lethal blossom of steel. But for Malenia, it was a brutal necessity. Each rotation was a way to shake off the mental lethargy that the rot tried to impose on her. The waterfowl dance became the signature move of the undefeated general. No warrior in the lands between could find an opening in the flurry. It was a wall of blades that moved toward the enemy like a tidal wave. Malenia used this style to win every skirmish she fought during her early years. She was not just strong, she was untouchable. Her speed was her greatest asset. She could close the distance between herself and an enemy in the blink of an eye, delivering 100 strikes before they could even raise a shield. Psychologically, the dance was Malenia's way of staying pure. She believed that as long as she could perform the waterfowl dance, she was still herself. It was the proof of her discipline and her brother's success. The gold and the flow were working together to keep the monster at bay. She was a master of her own body, even if that body was mostly made of wood and metal. The dance was her prayer to the concept of the flow, a ritual that kept her heart beating in a world that wanted her to stop and rot. However, the intensity of the waterfowl dance also put an immense strain on her remaining human parts. It was a style that demanded everything from her. She was burning her own life force to maintain the speed needed to stay ahead of the decay, but she never slowed down. She had a brother to protect and a sanctuary to build. The waterfowl dance was the tool she would use to clear the path for Miquella. It was the most beautiful thing in the world, and it was the most dangerous. It was the peak of her martial journey. As she matured into a legendary warrior, Malenia made a profound decision to abandon her own individual identity. She did not want to be a queen or a ruler in her own right. Instead, she swore a solemn vow to become her brother's protector. She took the title of Blade of Miquella. This was not just a job, it was a total surrendering of her life to his vision. She recognized that Miquella had the mind to fix the world, but he lacked the physical strength to enforce his order. Malenia became that strength. She was the muscle, and he was the mind. Together, the twins turned their backs on the capital and founded the Halig Tree. This was a massive golden tree intended to be a sanctuary for all those who were excluded by the Golden Order. It was meant to be a place where the cursed, the misbegotten, and the Albinorics could live in peace. Most importantly, it was meant to be the place where Miquella would finally find a permanent cure for Malenia's rot. Malenia became the general of this new sanctuary. She was the one who protected the tree from the jealous eyes of the Erd Tree and the other demigods. Malenia's devotion to Miquella was the defining feature of her character. She saw him as the only pure thing in a corrupt world. To her, his age of compassion was the only future worth fighting for. She allowed herself to be a tool for his ambition because she believed in his kindness. Every person she killed and every battle she won was a gift to her brother. She was his enforcer, his most loyal knight, and his twin soul. The Blade of Miquella was a name that inspired hope in the broken and terror in the powerful. The Haligtree was a monument to their partnership. It was grown with Miquella's blood and protected by Malenia's sword. It was a beautiful, sprawling city built into the branches of a giant tree. For a time, it seemed like they had succeeded. They had created a world outside the reach of the Golden Order. Malenia felt a sense of purpose she had never known. She was no longer just a victim of a curse. She was the guardian of a dream. She stood at the roots of the tree, a golden sentinel waiting for the day her brother would ascend to godhood. But this relationship had a parasitic quality that Malenia was blind to. By becoming his blade, she was giving up her own agency. She was seeing the world through Miquella's eyes. Her blindness was more than just physical. It was a total devotion that prevented her from seeing the flaws in her brother's plan. She was a warrior of infinite strength who had no will of her own. She was simply an extension of Miquella. This bond was the source of her greatest triumphs and the root of her eventual horrific downfall. When the Elden Ring was shattered and the demigods went to war, Malenia was forced to take the field of battle. This was the beginning of the Shattering, a period of total chaos and civil war. Malenia led her Clean Rot knights on a blitzkrieg across the lands between. She was a force of nature that could not be stopped. From the frozen north to the golden fields of the capital, Malenia was undefeated in every skirmish. She moved with a speed that left her enemies bewildered. Her goal was clear. She had to clear a path for Miquella to gather the power needed for his ascension. The Clean Rot Knights were the most disciplined army in the world. They were led by a general who fought alongside them, a goddess of war who moved like golden light. Malenia's military genius was as sharp as her blade. She didn't just fight, she conquered. She bypassed fortified cities and struck directly at the heart of her enemies. She was a master of the fast attack, using her speed to end battles before they truly began. The world of the demigods was being torn apart, and Malenia was the one holding the sharpest piece of the blade. During this time, Malenia became a symbol of absolute martial perfection. She was the only demigod who never lost a single battle. She defeated Godric the Grafted and made him beg for mercy. She held her own against the defenses of the capital. She was the champion of the Haligtree, a warrior who seemed to be beyond the reach of mortal men. But the war was a stalemate. The other demigods were also powerful, and no one could claim enough great runes to mend the ring. The world was grinding to a halt in a cycle of endless violence. Malenia's motivation during the Shattering was entirely focused on Miquella. She didn't want a great rune for herself. She wanted to secure the world for her brother's new age. She saw the war as a necessary evil, a cleaning of the slate. But the longer the war lasted, the more pressure was put on her internal seal. The stress of constant combat and the constant movement of the flow were wearing her down. She was holding the rot at bay with sheer willpower, but the cracks were starting to show in her golden armor. The Shattering was the test of Malenia's character. She proved that she was the strongest being in the lands between. But she also proved that strength alone could not fix a broken world. The more she fought, the more the rot within her felt the call of the chaos. She was a general without a country, fighting for a brother who was hidden away in his tree. The The war was turning into a tragedy of attrition. Malenia knew that she needed a decisive victory to end the stalemate, and that need would eventually lead her to the dunes of Caelid. Malenia's most famous and consequential campaign was her sudden march to the south. After months of stalemate in the northern territories, she gathered her Rot knights and headed straight for the heart of the continent. She bypassed the heavily fortified Lendel, the royal capital, entirely. This was a strategic move that shocked the other demigods. She wasn't interested in the throne. She was heading for the Caelid Wilds, the domain of General Radan. This march was a surgical strike through the heart of the lands between, a display of military confidence that remains a legend in the history of the war. The march to the south was an incredible feat of logistics. Malenia and her knights travelled through the Liurnia of the lakes and across the bridges of Limgrave. They moved with a speed that prevented any other army from intercepting them. Along the way, she was met with awe and fear. People saw the blind goddess of war passing through their lands and knew that something historic was about to happen. Malenia was focused on one thing: Star Scourge Radan. She needed to meet the mightiest demigod on the battlefield to fulfill her brother's secret plan. Radan was the master of gravity and the strongest of all demigods. He was the one who held the stars in place and protected the old order. For Miquella's age of compassion to begin, the old lord had to be removed. Malenia was the only one capable of doing it. This march was not just about territory. It was about the collision of two different fates. It was the blade going to meet the Star Scourge. Malenia knew that this would be the toughest fight of her life, and she prepared her soul for the coming storm. As she entered the red wastes of Caelid, the atmosphere changed. The land was already harsh, but it was about to become a graveyard. Malenia's knights set up their camp on the Aeonia swamp, preparing for the final confrontation. Malenia herself spent the nights in meditation, focusing on the movement of the water and the seal of her golden arm. Surrounded by enemies and the encroaching rot, but she was calm. She was the blade of Miquella, and she had a duty to perform. The march to the south was the final act of the undefeated general. She had successfully brought her army to the doorstep of her greatest rival. The world was watching as the two titans prepared to clash. This was the moment Malenia's military genius was most visible. She had outmaneuvered everyone to get to this point. But the cost of the march was already showing. Her knights were tired, and the rot was whispering louder than ever. She was at the edge of the world, and she was about to make a choice that would change everything forever. In the vast dunes of Caelid, the two greatest powers of the Shattering finally met. This was the Battle of Aeonia, a conflict that pitted Malenia's speed and fluid swordsmanship against Radan's massive strength and gravity magic. It was a clash of the unstoppable and the immovable. Radan was a giant of a man who could pull the very stars from the sky, while Malenia was a golden blur that moved with the precision of a needle. The battle lasted for days, a whirlwind of steel, gravity, and blood that left both of their legendary armies decimated. The duel between the two demigods was the greatest in history. Neither could gain the upper hand. Every time Malenia found an opening, Radan's gravity magic would push her back. Every time Radan swung his massive blades, Malenia would dance around them like a leaf in the wind. They were perfectly matched. It was a stalemate of divine proportions. As the sun beat down on the red sands, the fate of Miquella's plan hung in the balance. If Malenia could not defeat Radahn, her brother would never be able to ascend to godhood. The cost of the battle was horrific. Thousands of Cleanrot knights and Redmane soldiers fell in the dunes. The Ionia swamp became a landscape of corpses. But the two generals didn't stop. They were both fueled by their own sense of duty and honor. Radahn fought to protect the stars and the order of his father. Malenia fought for the dream of her brother. It was a conflict of two different ages, two different philosophies of life. They were both undefeated, and neither was willing to be the first to yield. As the battle reached its peak, Malenia's physical limits were finally being reached. Her golden prosthetics were battered, and her spirit was exhausted. She realized that she could not win this fight through swordsmanship alone. Radahn was too strong, too resilient. He was a wall of muscle and cosmic energy that refused to break. For Malenia, this was a moment of crisis. She had promised to be the blade that cleared the path, and she was failing. The pressure of the rot within her was becoming unbearable, pushing against the golden seal with a desperate hunger. The Battle of Ionia was the moment Malenia's pride as a warrior was tested. She had always prided herself on being the blade, the one who could win through skill and flow. But skill was not enough to defeat the Star Scourge. To fulfill her brother's vow, she had to consider the unthinkable. She had to consider using the very thing she had spent her whole life fighting against. The stalemate in the dunes was the end of Malenia the warrior and the beginning of something much darker. The world was about to witness the first bloom of the Scarlet Ionia. To break the stalemate and fulfill her brother's secret vow, Malenia finally did the unthinkable. She surrendered her pride. She realized that she could not defeat Radahn while her rot was suppressed. In a moment of absolute desperation, she intentionally broke her unalloyed gold needle. This was the only thing keeping the god of rot at bay. By breaking it, she was inviting the monster back into her soul. She leapt onto Radahn's back, her body convulsing with the sudden surge of the parasite. She whispered her final words to him, and then she bloomed. The Scarlet Ionia was a biological explosion of cosmic proportions. A massive fungal flower erupted from Malenia's body, unleashing a biological nuke of rot across the entire continent of Caelid. The red waste was instantly transformed into a landscape of decay. The soldiers of both armies were rotted where they stood, turned into fungal husks. Radahn himself was hit at point-blank range. His mind was shattered by the rot, leaving him a mindless, cannibalistic beast wandering the dunes. Malenia had won the battle, but she had committed the great sin of her life. This bloom was a total surrender of Malenia's identity. She had spent her whole life resisting the rot, and in 1 second, she had given it everything it wanted. She had used the power of an outer god to win a mortal war. The bloom was a beautiful and horrific sight, a cloud of red spores that blotted out the sun. Caelid was lost to the rot forever, becoming a place of Scarlet Rot and kindred of rot. Malenia had achieved her goal of neutralizing Radahn, but she had destroyed a continent to do it. The cost to Malenia herself was absolute. The bloom left her in a catatonic state, her soul and body exhausted by the sudden release of energy. She fell into a deep coma, a hollow shell of the warrior she once was. Her golden prosthetics were scorched and broken. She had fulfilled her role as the blade, but she was no longer a person. She was a vessel that had finally cracked. The rot had won its first major victory over her will. The undefeated legend was now a sleeping corpse in a field of fungal ash. This act of desperation recontextualizes Malenia's character. She was not a monster who wanted to spread the rot. She was a desperate sister who was willing to commit a genocide to help her brother. Her kindness was so absolute that it led to the most horrific act of the shattering. The first bloom was the moment the blade of Miquella was broken. She had sacrificed her dignity, her army, and her soul for a vow. As she slept in the dunes, the world of Caelid began to rot away, a permanent monument to the day the goddess of rot first showed her face. Following the explosion in Caelid, Malenia fell into a deep and catatonic state. Her body was a hollowed shell. The bloom had drained her of every ounce of physical and spiritual energy, leaving her unconscious in the middle of a literal wasteland of her own making. Her army was gone. Her enemy was a mindless beast. The undefeated goddess was now a sleeping corpse, vulnerable to any scavenger or surviving soldier who stumbled across her. She was thousands of miles from her home in the Haligtree, and it seemed certain that she would die in the red mud of the Aeonia swamp. But Malenia was not alone. One of the few survivors of the bloom was a clean rot knight named Finlay. While others fled in terror or succumbed to the rot, Finlay remained loyal to her general. She found Malenia's broken body and made an impossible decision. She pulled the comatose demigod onto her back and began the journey north. This was not a simple march. It was a trek across the entire continent, through enemy territory and harsh landscapes, while Finlay herself was slowly being eaten by the very rot that Malenia had unleashed. The journey took months. Finlay had to fight off infinite enemies, from hungry beasts to vengeful soldiers, all while carrying the heavy weight of a demigod in golden armor. She did not have the luxury of grace or rest. She was a solitary knight protecting a fallen hero. This journey is one of the most heroic and tragic feats in the history of the lands between. Finlay gave everything she had to ensure her general returned to the roots of her tree. She was the only reason the blade of Miquella did not become a forgotten relic in the dunes of Caelid. When they finally reached the Haligtree, Finlay was at the end of her life. She had carried the rot in her lungs for so long that her body was finally giving out. She laid Malenia at the base of the tree and died shortly after. Finlay is remembered in the lore as one of the most legendary knights to ever live. She didn't fight for a throne or a rune. She fought for the woman who had led her into battle. Her sacrifice ensured that Malenia would survive to wake another day, though the world she returned to was vastly different from the one she left. Malenia remained in her coma at the roots of the Haligtree for years. She was a sleeping ghost. Her presence was a source of comfort to her surviving knights. But she was totally unaware of the world around her. She slept through the slow decay of her sanctuary and the theft of her brother. She was a warrior without a war, a general whose army had been reduced to a few loyal shadows. Finlay's journey had saved her life, but it had also trapped her in an eternal moment of failure. Malenia was home, but her soul was still back in the dunes of Aeonia. Gold Needle is perhaps the greatest masterpiece of science and spiritual engineering in the history of the lands between. It was not a magical trinket or a simple piece of jewelry. It was a sophisticated tool designed by Miquella to act as a barrier. The needle worked by suppressing the influence of outer gods. It acted like a lightning rod, drawing the chaotic energy of the rot god away from Malenia's soul and grounding it. As long as the needle was embedded in her flesh, Malenia could maintain her individual will. It was the only thing that kept her from becoming a puppet for a cosmic force of decay. The decision to break this needle in Kylid was the ultimate act of desperation. By removing the seal, Malenia was not just using a weapon, she was surrendering her soul. She knew exactly what would happen the moment the gold snapped. She was inviting the god of Rot to take up residence in her heart once again. This sacrifice was made solely for Miquella's ambition. She believed that fulfilling his vow was more important than her own sanity. She chose to become a monster so that her brother could become a god. It was a cold, calculated trade of her humanity for a victory on the battlefield. The needle itself represents the unalloyed philosophy of Miquella. It was a rejection of the Golden Order's reliance on the greater will. Miquella believed that through his own intellect and the use of pure materials, he could fix the world's fundamental flaws. The needle was the proof of his success, but its destruction proved that even the most perfect invention can be ruined by human emotion. Malenia's love for her brother was the one variable Miquella could not account for. Her heart was the alloy that caused the gold to fail. After the battle, the broken needle was lost in the swamp of Aeonia. Without its protection, the rot began to seep into the very foundations of the Haligtree. The needle was the dam holding back a flood, and once it was gone, the flood began. This loss is what led to the eventual fungal nightmare of Elphael. The needle was the symbol of the twins' independence and their hope for a cure. By breaking it, Malenia had effectively ended their dream. She had achieved a military goal, but she had destroyed the scientific miracle that was keeping her family together. The needle's final fate is tied to the player's journey. Finding the broken pieces and repairing the needle is one of the most important quests in the game. It allows the player to potentially give Malenia back the dignity she threw away. But even a repaired needle cannot erase the fact that she chose to break it. The needle is a reminder that in the world of Elden Ring, power always comes at a price. Malenia bought a stalemate with a continent and paid for it with the only thing that made her truly human. While Malenia slept in her deep coma at the base of the Haligtree, her body continued to act as a source for the Scarlet Rot. Even without her conscious will, the parasite within her was active. It began to leak out of her pores and into the very roots of the tree. The Haligtree was meant to be a holy sanctuary, grown with Miquella's blood to be a pure replacement for the Erd tree. But Malenia's presence was turning it into a fungal nightmare. The water in the canals became stagnant and red. The leaves began to droop with the weight of fungal growths. The sanctuary was becoming a tomb. This decay was a physical reflection of Malenia's internal state. Because she had broken her needle, she was no longer a closed system. She was a fountain of rot. The beautiful city of Elphael, built into the branches of the tree, began to dissolve. The architecture was overtaken by red sludge and massive mushrooms. The citizens who remained were either infected or driven mad by the changing environment. The Haligtree was dying from the inside out, poisoned by the very woman who was supposed to be its protector. It was a tragic irony that Malenia was destroying the only home she ever loved. The Rot God saw the Haligtree as a perfect garden. It used Malenia as the seed to transform the tree into a great tree of rot. The cycle of life and rebirth that Miquella had tried to establish was being subverted. Instead of pure souls returning to the roots, they were being consumed by the fungus. The Haligtree was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a warning. It showed that the influence of the outer gods could not be escaped. even in the furthest corners of the world. Malenia's coma was a period of slow, environmental disaster for her people. The surviving Clean Rot knights and soldiers watched this decay with a sense of religious dread. They stayed by her side, but they were breathing in the spores every day. They were becoming part of the fungal ecosystem. The pests and kindred of rot began to move into the lower levels of the tree, seeing the rot as a blessing. The holy city was being replaced by a swamp. The stagnation that Malenia had fought her whole life to avoid through her swordsmanship had finally claimed her home. The water had stopped flowing, and the rot had taken root. When Malenia finally wakes, she is surrounded by the ruins of her brother's dream. She is sitting in a pool of stagnant, rotten water at the bottom of a dying tree. The halig tree is a shadow of its former glory, a monument to the cost of her bloom in Caelid. She has become the very thing she feared, a source of stagnation. The tree is a physical record of her failure. She wanted to clear a path for Miquella, but she ended up poisoning the destination. The rotting halig tree is the final evidence that the twins' rebellion against the gods had ended in a tragic fungal stalemate. While Malenia was trapped in her long coma, and her knights were busy trying to manage the rot, a second tragedy struck the halig tree. Morg, the Lord of Blood, infiltrated the sanctuary. He bypassed the defenses and reached the roots of the tree where Miquella was undergoing his transformation. Miquella had embedded himself in a cocoon, hoping to use his blood to grow the tree and finally achieve adulthood. Morg tore the cocoon from the roots and kidnapped the sleeping prince. He took him deep underground to his palace, intending to use Miquella to start his own blood-soaked dynasty. This theft happened while Malenia was at her most vulnerable. She was the blade, the shield of her brother, and she was not there to protect him. This was the ultimate failure of her vow. She had gone to Caelid to clear the way for him, and in doing so, she had left him completely defenseless. Morg's intrusion was a violation of everything the twins had built. He didn't just steal a person, he stole the future of the halig tree. Without Miquella's presence, the tree stopped growing, and the hope for a cure vanished. The theft was the final blow to the sanctuary. When Malenia finally woke from her coma, she found a world of silence and rot. She reached out for her brother and found only an empty space in the roots. The realization must have been devastating. Everything she had sacrificed in Caelid, her pride, her sanity, her army, had been for nothing. Her brother was gone, and she had no idea where he was. She was blind, broken, and alone in a rotting palace. The theft of the cocoon turned her military victory over Radan into a pointless, cosmic tragedy. She had won the battle, but lost the one thing she was fighting for. She remained at the base of the tree because she had nowhere else to go. She was waiting for a brother who would never return to her. She sat in the darkness, her mind likely looping back to the moment she broke the needle. She was waiting for Miquella to come back and fix the world, not knowing that he was being used by another demigod in the dark. Her vigil was a state of pure, stagnant despair. She was the blade without a hand to wield her. She was a protector who had failed her only charge. The theft of the cocoon is what sets the stage for the player's encounter with Malenia. By the time we find her, she is a shell of a woman. She is clinging to the memory of her brother because it is the only thing she has left. She introduces herself as Malenia, Blade of Miquella, because that title is her only connection to a reality that no longer exists. She is a warrior, waiting for a command that will never come. The empty roots of the halig tree are a constant reminder of her failure, a hole in the world that no amount of gold or rot can ever fill. In the aftermath of the bloom in the swamp of Aeonia, something strange and biological occurred. Several daughters, or offshoots, were born from the concentrated rot Malenia left behind. These are not biological children in the traditional sense. They are the sisters, including Millicent and her siblings, Mary, Maureen, Pollyanna, and Amy. They are physical manifestations of Malenia's soul and her discarded humanity. When Malenia bloomed, she didn't just release spores. She shed pieces of her identity. These pieces took on a life of their own, growing in the red mud like fungal blossoms. Each of the sisters represents a different facet of Malenia's personality. Some are aggressive and warlike, while others are passive and small. Millicent is the most important among them. She represents Malenia's will to resist the rot. She was born with the same curse and the same missing limb, but she also possessed the same iron discipline. While Malenia was sleeping in her coma, Millicent was a wandering echo of who Malenia used to be. The sisters are the fragments of a broken goddess, wandering a world that has already moved on from their mother's legend. Gowry, a sage who worships the rot, views these sisters as candidates for a new goddess. He wants one of them to bloom and take Malenia's place. He sees them as buds waiting to flower. This highlights the horrific, parasitic nature of the rot god. It is always looking for the next host. The sisters were born from a tragedy, but to the followers of the rot, they are a promise of a new age. They are the biological insurance policy for a cosmic cycle of decay. Millicent, however, refuses this fate. She wants to be a person, not a bud. The existence of the sisters proves that Malenia's great sin in Caelid had unexpected biological consequences. She didn't just rot the land, she populated it with her own ghosts. These sisters are a reminder that Malenia is no longer a single, unified being. She is fragmented. To truly understand Malenia, the player must interact with Millicent. Through her, we see the side of Malenia that valued dignity, swordsmanship, and independence. The sisters are a living record of everything Malenia lost the moment she leaped onto Radan's back. The journey of the sisters is a parallel to Malenia's own life. They are all cursed, they are all warriors, and they are all tied to the dream of the halig tree. Millicent's quest to find Malenia is an attempt to reunite the fragments of a broken soul. She wants to return the will to the blade. But the sisters also represent a threat. They are the potential next blooms. They show that the cycle of the Scarlet Rot is self-sustaining, and that Malenia's individual struggle is just one small part of a much larger, much more terrifying cosmic process. Part 16, Millicent's Quest. Finding the Will. Millicent's quest is one of the most emotional and lore-heavy journeys in the game. When the player finds her, she is rotting away in a church, having lost her arm and her memories. She is a victim of the same curse that haunts Malenia. Through the player's help, she receives a prosthetic arm and a gold needle. As she regains her strength, she also regains her purpose. She begins to realize that she is a part of Malenia. She describes her goal not as a desire for power, but as a desire to return the will that Malenia discarded in the swamp of Aeonia. Millicent represents the dignity of Malenia. She is the side of the demigod that would rather die as a human than live as a goddess of rot. Throughout her journey, she follows the same path Malenia once took, traveling from the south to the Halig tree. She is a mirror image of her mother. By helping Millicent, the player is essentially helping Malenia's better half find its way home. Millicent's ultimate choice, to pull out the needle and die as herself rather than blooming, is a direct critique of Malenia's choice in Caelid. Millicent realizes that the Rot god is using her. She understands that her purpose, according to the sages, is to become a monster. By choosing to rot away quietly, she is performing the ultimate act of resistance. She is proving that even a fragment of Malenia is stronger than the outer god. Her death is a quiet tragedy, but it is also a victory for the human spirit. She dies with her identity intact, something Malenia was unable to do. Millicent is the hero that Malenia could have been if she hadn't been so blinded by her brother's needs. The return of the needle to Malenia's flower after her death is the conclusion of this quest. The player takes the needle that Millicent used and places it in the scarlet bloom. This is a symbolic act of returning Malenia's lost will to her. It is an attempt to heal the great sin committed in Caelid. Millicent's journey was a long, painful pilgrimage to offer her mother a choice. She wanted to give Malenia the chance to be a warrior again, rather than just a vessel for the fungus. Ultimately, Millicent's story highlights the tragedy of Malenia's agency. Malenia was so focused on being a blade that she forgot how to be a person. Millicent, who had nothing, found the strength to be a person first. She is the conscience of the story. She shows us what Malenia gave up to win a war. By the time we reach Malenia, Millicent's sacrifice has already been made. The will is waiting to be reclaimed, but Malenia is already too far gone into the dream of the Rot. Millicent is the light of the Halig tree that was extinguished too soon. Fans debated why Malenia would commit such a horrific act as rotting Caelid just to defeat Radan. The Shadow of the Erdtree expansion finally provides the answer. It was to fulfill a childhood vow. Miquella needed Radan to die. His plan for the Age of Compassion required a Lord Consort of absolute strength. He had chosen Radan for this role long ago, but Radan could not go to the Land of Shadow as long as his soul was tied to his physical body in the lands between. Malenia was the executioner sent to prepare the groom for her brother's ascension. This revelation changes everything about Malenia's character. She wasn't fighting for territory or a great rune. She was a biological assassin. Her march to the south was a mission to liberate Radan's soul so it could be resurrected in the Shadow Realm. This explains the absolute desperation of her bloom. She wasn't just trying to win a battle. She was trying to complete a task for her god. She was so committed to Miquella's dream that she was willing to destroy a continent to ensure the Lord was ready for his god. Malenia was the only one Miquella could trust with such a burden. She was the blade, and this was her most important strike. But it was a strike that required her to destroy herself. She had to become the goddess of Rot to kill the Star Scourge. Miquella's plan was built on the systematic exploitation of his sister's loyalty. He knew she would never say no to him. He used her love to fuel a genocide. Malenia was the primary tool in a divine game of soul transference, a role that left her broken and forgotten in a dying tree. The vow between Miquella and Radan is the hidden heartbeat of the story. Malenia was the one who had to enforce it. This makes her march to the south feel much more tragic. She wasn't a general leading a crusade. She was a sister doing a dirty job for her brother. She was the one who had to carry the guilt and the rot, while Miquella remained unalloyed in his cocoon. The vow was a contract written in the blood of Kaelid, and Malenia was the one who had to sign it. Ultimately, the revelation of the vow proves that Malenia was the ultimate victim of her own loyalty. Her vision was entirely focused on Miquella's goals, preventing her from seeing the horror of what she was doing. She was a blind follower in every sense of the word. She gave up her continent, her army, and her sanity to fulfill a promise that wasn't even hers. She was the enforcer of a kindness that required a massacre to begin. The Blade of Miquella was a title that cost her everything, and the vow was the reason why. Part 18. The Whisper in the Dunes. During the cinematic trailer for the base game, Malenia is seen leaping onto Radun's back and whispering something into his ear just before she blooms. For a long time, this was a mystery. The expansion finally reveals the words, "Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." This one sentence recontextualizes the entire game. It confirms that Malenia was not fighting a rival. She was delivering a message. She was preparing a groom for her brother. The bloom was not an act of rage, but a ritual of transition. She was telling Radun that his time to die had come. This whisper is chilling because it shows Malenia's absolute commitment to the ritual. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a priestess of a new order. The Scarlet Aeonia was the incense for the ceremony. She was sacrificing her own soul to send Radun to her brother. The whisper proves that she was in total agreement with Miquella's plan. She was a willing participant in the surgical soul transference that would eventually create the final boss of the DLC. She was the bridge between the world of the living and the world of the shadow. The whisper also highlights the tragic disconnect between Malenia and the world around her. While her knights were dying and Kaelid was burning, she was focused on a childhood promise. She had been charmed by her brother's vision to the point where she could no longer see the reality of her actions. Her kindness was a form of tunnel vision. She believed that the ends justified the means. The whisper was the final confirmation that Malenia had surrendered her agency to Miquella. She was his voice, his blade, and his sacrifice. Radun's reaction to the whisper is unknown, but his physical response was immediate. The rot hit him at point-blank range, shattering his mind. This was the unintended consequence of the whisper. Malenia wanted to kill him, but she only succeeded in breaking him. This led to the centuries of suffering for Radun and the stagnation of the Haligtree. The whisper was a death sentence that took a long time to carry out. It was a promise of a future that required a nightmare of a present. Ultimately, the whisper in the dunes is the moment the Blade of Miquella became a god of rot. She used the power of the curse to enforce the will of her brother. She was a woman of two masters, the outer god of rot and the Empyrean Miquella. In that moment, their interests aligned. They both wanted the bloom. The whisper was the signal that the old world was ending and a new fungal age was beginning. It was the most important sentence spoken in the history of the Shattering, a whisper that echoed across a continent and through the halls of time. Part 19. The Blindness of the Blade. Malenia's physical blindness is one of her most iconic traits, but it is also deeply symbolic. She lost her sight to the rot early in her life, forcing her to rely on the teachings of the blind swordsman to perceive the world through rhythm and flow. But her blindness extends far beyond her physical eyes. She was blind to the rot that was consuming her, blind to the suffering she caused in Kaelid, and most importantly, blind to the fact that her brother was using her as a tool. She was a blind follower of a god who had discarded his own heart to achieve his goals. Her vision was entirely replaced by Miquella's dream. She didn't see the world as it was. She saw it as Miquella promised it could be. This made her the perfect blade. She didn't question her orders because she couldn't see the cost of those orders. She was insulated from the reality of her actions by her own devotion. Her blindness allowed her to maintain her sense of purity, even as she unleashed a biological apocalypse. She believed she was still the blade of Miquella, a holy protector, even as she became the goddess of Rot. This symbolic blindness is what separates her from Millicent. Millicent, who regained her sight and her memories, was able to see the horror of the rot. She chose to die rather than bloom. Malenia, however, remained blind to the end. She died believing her brother was still in the tree, waiting for her. She died introducing herself by her title, unable to see that she was sitting in a ruin. Her blindness was her armor, but it was also her cage. It prevented her from ever achieving true agency or self-reflection. The Blade of Miquella title is a testament to this blindness. She didn't see herself as a person with her own needs. She saw herself only as an extension of someone else. This is a form of spiritual blindness that the lore explores deeply. By giving up her will to her brother, she had lost the ability to navigate the world on her own. She was a passenger in her own body, steered by the needs of a god. Her physical blindness was just a manifestation of a much deeper, much more tragic lack of perspective. Ultimately, the blindness of Malenia is what makes her such a sympathetic figure. She isn't a villain who wanted to destroy the world. She is a woman who was so lost in a dream that she couldn't see the nightmare she was creating. She was a victim of her own capacity for love and loyalty. Her blindness was a gift from her brother, a way for her to survive the agony of her existence by focusing on a beautiful lie. When she finally wakes to fight the player, she is still blind, still waiting, and still hopelessly devoted to a brother who had already left her behind. Part 20. The Clean Rot Knights' Eternal Malady. The Clean Rot Knights were Malenia's personal army, and they are perhaps the most tragic group of warriors in the entire game. They were not normal soldiers. They were people who chose to serve Malenia, knowing full well that they would eventually rot from within. They were the unwavering loyalists who followed their general into the heart of Caelid. Their name, Clean Rot, is a contradiction. They were attempting to maintain a state of purity while being consumed by a terminal illness. They are the physical manifestation of the fanatical love that Miquella and Malenia inspired. To keep their bodies from falling apart, the knights bound their flesh to their armor with wax. This was a literal sealing of their decay. They lived in constant pain, their lungs filled with spores and their blood turning to red sludge. They didn't fight for a throne or a rune. They fought for the blade of Miquella. They saw her as a goddess of war who shared their suffering. This shared malady created a bond between the general and her knights that was stronger than any legal oath. They were a legion of the dying, marching toward a victory that they would never live to see. The Clean Rot Knights represent the cost of Malenia's military success. Every battle she won was a battle where her knights became more stagnant. By the time of the Battle of Aeonia, they were barely human. They were fungal husks held together by gold and wax. When Malenia bloomed, her knights were the first to be consumed. Those who survived became the kindred of Rot, lost to the very thing they had spent their lives fighting. They are the forgotten army of a forgotten crusade, left to rot in the swamps of Caelid. and the Halig tree. Their tragedy is that their loyalty was their undoing. They believed in Miquella's age of compassion, not knowing that the age required their own biological destruction. They were the vessels for a dream that had no room for them. The Clean Rot Knights are a reminder that the kindness of a god often requires the suffering of the people. They gave their lives and their bodies to a woman who was herself a tool. They are the broken blades of the Halig tree, a testament to the fact that love can be just as destructive as hate. Ultimately, the Clean Rot Knights are the physical proof of Malenia's influence. She was a leader who could inspire people to embrace a horrific death for a noble cause. They were the shadow of her legend. When we encounter them in the game, they are silent, aggressive, and pathetic. They are still patrolling the ruins of a city that no longer exists, still protecting a general who is asleep. They are the victims of the long malady, a war that never ended, and a rot that never stops. They are the unwavering followers of a blind goddess, dying for a promise that was never meant for them. When the player finally confronts Malenia at the base of her tree, the battle eventually forces her into a final, horrific transformation. This is the second phase of the fight, where she becomes the goddess of Rot. It is the moment where Malenia's story reaches its ultimate point of failure. She sheds her clothes and her golden prosthetics, finally embracing the monster she spent her entire life trying to suppress. She stops being a swordswoman and becomes a vessel for the cosmic power of decay. It is a beautiful and terrifying sight, but it represents the death of her humanity. The wings that sprout from her back are not made of feathers. They are a mass of Aeonian butterflies. These are creatures that represent the paradox of the rot. They are fragile and beautiful, but they live for a single, destructive moment of bloom. By taking this form, Malenia is admitting that she can no longer hold the line. She is giving the outer god exactly what it wanted since the day she was born. She is no longer the blade of Miquella. She is the physical manifestation of a cycle that seeks to turn the world into a stagnant, fungal swamp. This transformation is the result of her desperation. Just like in Kylid, she realizes that her skill with a blade is not enough to stop the player. She turns to the rot as a last resort. This is the tragic core of her character. Every time she is pushed to her limit, she betrays herself to save her brother's dream. She is willing to become an abomination if it means she can keep her vow. But in doing so, she loses the very thing she was fighting to protect, her own identity. She becomes a god of everything she hates. The goddess of Rot phase is a whirlwind of chaos and scarlet energy. She no longer relies on the rhythm of flowing water. She strikes with the weight of an entire ecosystem of decay. She is a force of nature that has finally broken through its cage. The player is not just fighting a warrior anymore. You are fighting the biological end of the world. Malenia is the centerpiece of a nightmare, a woman who has been hollowed out to make room for a divinity that offers nothing but stagnation and rot. Ultimately, this phase is a moment of profound sadness. We are witnessing the final collapse of a great person. Malenia's second bloom is a surrender. It is a sign that the gold was never enough. The Goddess of Rot is a title she never wanted, yet it is the only one she has left at the end. She dies as a magnificent monster, a creature of red light and fungal wings. She is a goddess who achieved her status by failing her most important internal battle. She is the bloom that destroyed its own garden. Part 22. The symbolism of flowing water. The philosophy of flowing water is the most important lore thread in Malenia's martial identity. In the lands between, and in many real-world traditions, stagnant water is seen as the breeding ground for disease and rot. It is still. It is silent. It allows things to fester. Flowing water, however, is seen as pure and life-giving. It is constantly moving and constantly changing. Malenia's entire combat style was a physical meditation on this concept. She believed that as long as she could keep her body and her blade in a state of flow, she could stay ahead of the rot within her. Her swordsmanship was a form of spiritual hygiene. It was her way of keeping her soul clean. The waterfowl dance was the peak of this idea. It was a flurry of motion that never allowed her to be still. This was the only way she knew how to fight the stagnation of the outer god. But this philosophy required absolute perfection. If she stopped moving for even a second, the rot would take root. She was like a river that had to keep flowing to stay fresh. The moment she sat down at the base of the tree and waited for her brother, she became stagnant. This stagnation is reflected in her boss arena. She is found in a still, quiet pond at the bottom of a dead tree. The water there does not move. It is a mirror of her own internal state during her long coma. Because she stopped flowing, the rot was able to take over her sanctuary. The goddess of rot is the queen of stagnant water. She is the mistress of the swamp. By the time we find her, she has abandoned the teachings of the blind swordsman. She has given in to the stillness of the fungus. The tragedy of the flow is that it was always a temporary fix. You cannot run forever. Eventually, every river reaches a lake or an ocean where it must stop. For Malenia, that ocean was the dunes of Kylid. By breaking her needle and blooming, she turned herself into a stagnant pool of red spores. She traded the movement of the river for the power of the swamp. She became the very thing her mentor warned her about. The flowing water was her armor, and she threw it away for a moment of absolute stagnant power. When we fight her, we see the remnants of that flow in her movements, but it is corrupted. She is a dancer who has forgotten the music. She is trying to mimic the rhythm of the river while being weighed down by the sludge of the rot. The symbolism of the water is the story of her life. She started as a mountain stream full of potential and purity. She ended as a polluted lake, still and silent and filled with death. The water is gone, and only the rot remains. Part 23. The third bloom, divinity achieved. According to the lore found on items like the Scarlet Aeonia spell, Malenia must bloom 3 times to reach her final state as a true goddess. This creates a fascinating and terrifying mystery regarding her transformation. The first bloom occurred in the dunes of Kylid during her battle with Radan. That was the event that destroyed an entire continent. The second bloom occurs during the player's boss fight, when she transitions into her second phase. This leaves one final bloom remaining to complete the prophecy of her divinity. There is a great deal of debate among scholars about when this third bloom happens. Some believe that her death at the hands of the player is the catalyst for the final transformation. When she is defeated, a massive scarlet flower is left behind in the arena. It is possible that the player, by pushing her to her limit, accidentally finalized her journey into becoming a permanent goddess of rot. By killing the warrior, we may have birthed the god. If this is true, then Malenia's story does not end with her death. It begins a new, darker chapter for the world. The idea of the true goddess is a nightmare for the lands between. It would mean a being of absolute decay, that can never be killed or suppressed. A third bloom would likely mean the end of the Erd tree's influence and the beginning of a fungal age. Malenia was the only thing holding that power back. By removing her will, the player has removed the only barrier. The flower sitting in the roots of the Halig tree is a ticking time bomb. It is a seed of divinity, waiting for the right moment to open and consume everything that remains. This prophecy highlights the futility of the player's victory. We go to the Halig tree to stop a threat, but we might have actually fulfilled its destiny. Malenia was a woman caught in a biological trap. The more she fought to survive, the closer she got to blooming. The more we fight her, the more we help the Rot god achieve its goal. It is a classic tragedy, where every action taken to avoid a fate only serves to bring it about. The 3 blooms are the milestones of Malenia's descent from a princess to a parasite. Whether the 3rd bloom has already happened or is yet to come, the true goddess is the shadow that hangs over the Halig tree. Malenia's sacrifice in Caelid was the first step on a path she couldn't leave. Her death in Elphael was the second. The world is now waiting for the final petals to open. The story of the 3 blooms is the story of a woman who was hunted by her own potential. She was a blossom that was forced to open, and the world will have to live with the seeds she left behind. Part 24. The Butterfly Connection. One of the most subtle and beautiful pieces of lore in Elden Ring is the connection between the demigods and the butterflies found in the world. There are 3 primary types of butterflies, and each one is linked to a child of Marika. The smouldering butterfly is tied to Malenia and her flame. The nascent butterfly represents Miquella and his state of eternal childhood. Finally, the Aeonian butterfly is the symbol of Malenia. These creatures are not just insects. They are physical representations of the fundamental pillars of the world's cycle of rebirth. The Aeonian butterfly is described as a creature that was once a grub living in the rot before it finally took wing. This is a perfect metaphor for Malenia's life. She lived as a grub in the agony of her curse, struggling through the mud of her own biology. Her transformation into the goddess of rot was her taking wing. But unlike a normal butterfly, her flight is destructive. Her wings are made of spores and death. She represents a version of rebirth that competes directly with the Erd tree. It is a fungal, horizontal rebirth that seeks to replace the vertical grace of the gold. These butterflies prove that Malenia is a central figure in the mechanics of the universe. She isn't just a sick girl, she is a cosmic force. Her rot is a way for the world to start over when the fire has gone out. It is the rot that breaks down the old so the new can grow. But this process is violent and indifferent to human suffering. The butterflies are the messengers of this cycle. They are found in places where the rot has taken hold, a silent sign that Malenia's influence is spreading. They are beautiful, but they are a warning of the coming bloom. The connection between the 3 butterflies also suggests a deep bond between the siblings. They are all parts of the same cosmic ecosystem. Malenia provides the fire to burn the world. Miquella provides the dream of a new beginning. Malenia provides the rot to break down the old structures. They are the rebirth team of the lands between. But because the world is broken, their roles have become warped. Malenia's rot has become a weapon instead of a natural process. Her butterflies are now a symbol of genocide instead of transformation. Ultimately, the Aeonian butterflies are the only things that remain of Malenia after she is gone. They flutter around her flower, a haunting memory of a woman who could have been a gentle goddess. They are the children of her bloom, carrying her spores to distant lands. The butterfly connection shows that Malenia was always part of a larger plan, a plan that existed long before she was born. She was a pillar of the world, and her collapse into rot has sent ripples through the entire ecosystem of the lands between. Part 25. The Blue Fairy and the Lake of Rot. The Blue Dancer charm tells a story of a fairy clad in blue who gave a legendary swordsman a blade of flowing water. This is the same swordsman who taught Malenia how to fight. This fairy is one of the most mysterious figures in the lore. Many scholars believe she is a representative of the ancient forces of the earth that live in the Lake of Rot. This creates a profound and ironic connection. It would mean that Malenia's fighting style, the very thing she used to stay pure, actually originated from the same place as her curse. Her cure and her curse were born from the same water. The Lake of Rot is a massive, subterranean sea of concentrated scarlet rot located deep beneath the earth. It is said to be the place where the god of rot was sealed by the blind swordsman. If the blue fairy came from this place, it suggests that the flow is the natural enemy of the rot. It is the earth's own immune system. By following the philosophy of the fairy, Malenia was using the antidote created by the planet itself. She was fighting a cosmic infection with a terrestrial remedy. This makes her journey feel much more tied to the ancient history of the world. However, this connection remains a theory. Some believe the blue fairy was a manifestation of the spirit of the river, or an ancient ancestor of the Carian royalty. But the link to the rot is too strong to ignore. The Blue Dancer style is all about lightness and speed, the exact opposites of the heavy, stagnant rot. Malenia was a woman of two worlds, the celestial world of the outer gods and the deep, hidden world of the blue fairy. She was caught in a tug of war between these two powers, and her body was the rope. This lore beat adds a layer of depth to Malenia's combat style. She wasn't just swinging a sword. She was practicing a form of ancient, elemental magic. Every time she used the waterfowl dance, she was summoning the spirit of the flowing water to push back the encroaching fungus. Her sword was a religious icon of the Earth's resistance. But because she was an Empyrean of the Golden Order, she was fundamentally disconnected from the source of that power. She was using a remedy that she didn't fully understand, which is why it eventually failed her in Caelid. Ultimately, the story of the Blue Fairy and the Swordsman shows that the struggle against the rot has been going on for eons. Malenia was just the latest champion in a war that started at the beginning of time. Her failure was not a personal weakness, but a sign that the god of rot was becoming too strong for the old ways to contain. The lake remains as a silent, red reminder of what happens when the water stops flowing. Malenia's style was a beautiful attempt to keep the river moving, but the ocean of rot was always waiting beneath her feet. Part 26. The Unalloyed. Gold Needle's Final Fate. If the player follows Millicent's journey to its conclusion, the unalloyed gold needle eventually finds its way back into our hands. This is the same needle that Malenia broke in Caelid. By taking this repaired needle and using it on the massive scarlet flower left behind after Malenia's death, the player receives Miquella's needle. This is a legendary item with a very specific and powerful purpose. It is the only thing in the entire game capable of taming the influence of the frenzied flame. This proves that Malenia's ultimate sacrifice provided the only tool in the world capable of stopping total chaos. The frenzied flame is an outer god that seeks to melt everything back into a single chaotic mass. It is the ultimate end of the world. The fact that Miquella's gold needle, the one Malenia carried, can stop this flame is a testament to the twins' brilliance. Even in her death, Malenia is still being a shield for the world. Her rot was a horror, but the needle she bore contains the secret to resisting the cosmic madness. By finishing Millicent's quest, the player is essentially redeeming Malenia's failure. We are taking her broken history and turning it into a tool for the future. This provides a sense of closure to Malenia's tragedy. Her life was defined by being a blade for her brother, and even after she is gone, her equipment is still doing his work. The needle is a bridge between her story and the fate of the entire world. It shows that Miquella's unalloyed gold was a success, even if it couldn't save his sister. It could save the player from a fate worse than death. Malenia's sacrifice in Caelid was a sin, but the needle that survived the bloom is a blessing. It is the last legacy of the blade of Miquella. The transformation of the needle into Miquella's needle also suggests a spiritual reunion. By placing the needle in Malenia's flower, we are bringing the siblings together one last time. We are returning the brother's gift to the sister's remains. This act of mending is what finally allows the player to influence the ending of the game in a meaningful way. Malenia died so that the player could have the choice she never had. Her blood and her gold are the keys to the final lock. Ultimately, the needle's final fate is the only part of Malenia's story that has a silver lining. It proves that her suffering was not entirely in vain. She carried a heavy burden her whole life, and that burden became the world's only hope for salvation. The needle is a small golden object that carries the weight of two demigods' lives. It is the final blade that the player can use to cut through the influence of the gods. Malenia is gone, but the needle remains, a silent and powerful reminder of the twin prodigies' fight for independence. Part 27, Malenia versus Miquella. The power dynamic. To understand Malenia, you have to understand the dynamic she shared with her brother. Their relationship was a parasitic symbiosis. Miquella was the dreamer, a being of pure intellect and divine potential, who remained unalloyed by the physical world. Malenia was the sufferer, the blade, and the shield. She was the one who absorbed all the physical pain and biological rot of their lineage. She was the one who went into the mud and the blood so that Miquella could stay clean in his cocoon. Her purity was sacrificed so that his could be maintained. This power dynamic was fundamentally unequal. Malenia worshipped Miquella as a god, while he viewed her as his most loyal tool. He loved her, certainly, but it was the love of a master for a perfect instrument. He gave her the gold to keep her sane, but he also gave her the mission that would eventually destroy her. Malenia was so focused on being his blade that she didn't realize she was the only one paying the price for his ambition. She was the filter for his glory. She took the alloys of the world into herself so he could remain pure gold. This relationship is what makes her blindness so symbolic. She was blind to the fact that her brother was exploiting her loyalty. Miquella's Age of Compassion was a beautiful dream, but it was built on the back of his sister's genocide in Caelid. He needed a lord, and he sent his sister to murder their brother to get one. Malenia was the cleanup crew for a god's conscience. She did the dirty work so Miquella's hands could stay white. Her fanatical devotion was her greatest strength, but it was also her blindfold. In the lore of the Halig tree, this dynamic is visible everywhere. the city is beautiful and golden at the top, where Miquella resided. But at the bottom, where Malenia sits, it is a rotting, fungal mess. The brother stayed in the light, and the sister lived in the shadow. This is the reality of their unalloyed experiment. It didn't cure the rot, it just moved it all onto Malenia. She was the waste basket for the family's sins. She accepted this role without question, because she believed her brother was the only thing in the world worth saving. Ultimately, Malenia and Miquella are a tragic duo. They tried to fix the world, but they ended up destroying each other. Malenia's identity was entirely swallowed by Miquella's needs. She died as his blade, not as herself. Their relationship proves that in the world of Elden Ring, kindness and compassion often have a hidden, bloody cost. Malenia paid that cost in full. She was a woman of infinite strength who allowed herself to be a footstool for a god. Her story is the story of a protector who was consumed by the person she was protecting. Part 28. The Spirit of the Valkyrie. Malenia is modelled after the Valkyries of Norse mythology, the choosers of the slain who ushered heroic souls to Valhalla. This role is crucial to her actions in the shadow of the Erd Tree. By marching to Caelid and killing Radahn, she was performing her function as a Valkyrie. She was choosing the mightiest soul to be her brother's consort. She wasn't a conqueror, she was a psychopomp. She was a figure who ushered souls from the world of the living to the world of the gods. Her blade was the tool she used to harvest the consort that Miquella needed for his ascension. This role makes her a bridge between the two games. She is the connection between the shattering and the land of shadow. In the base game, she seems like a failed general, but in the expansion, she is revealed as a successful harvester. She did exactly what she was supposed to do. She delivered the soul of Radahn to the gate of divinity. This puts her in a position of religious significance. She was the high priestess of Miquella's new order, using her sword as a ritual knife. She was a Valkyrie who gave her own life to ensure the warrior reached the god. The imagery of the Valkyrie is everywhere in her design. Her helmet, her wings, and her status as an undefeated warrior all point to this mythic role. But in typical Elden Ring fashion, the role is corrupted. A traditional Valkyrie is a noble servant of a god. Malenia is a rotting servant of a child. Her Valhalla is a lightless land of shadow and corpses. She isn't ushering souls to glory. She is ushering them to a state of forced compassion. She is a fallen Valkyrie, a being who is performing a holy task through horrific means. This role also explains her clean rot knights. They are her Einherjar, the chosen warriors who fight and die at her side. They followed her to Caelid to help her choose the slain. They were participants in a massive, continental-scale ritual. This makes the shattering feel much more like a religious ceremony and less like a political war. Malenia was the master of ceremonies, and the Scarlet Aeonia was her final offering. She fulfilled her mythic role perfectly, but it cost her everything she had. Ultimately, Malenia as a Valkyrie shows the transcendental nature of her character. She wasn't just a princess, she was a cosmic function. She was the one who decided who was worthy to enter the next age. By choosing Radahn, she set the stage for the end of the game. She was the hand of fate. But like all figures in Elden Ring, her destiny was a prison. She was a Valkyrie who couldn't leave the battlefield. She stayed at the roots of her tree, waiting for a reward that would never come. She had chosen the slain, but she had also chosen her own extinction. Part 29. The Final Resting Place. Elphael Malenia finally met her end in Elphael, Brace of the Halig Tree. This location is one of the most beautiful and tragic places in the entire game. It is a golden, intricate city built into the side of a massive tree, representing the peak of the twins' architectural and spiritual ambition. But it is also a place that is actively being dissolved by red sludge. It is a city that is rotting from the inside out. This perfectly mirrors Malenia's own body. She was a golden warrior who was being consumed by an internal fungus. She died in a palace that she inadvertently turned into a tomb. The descent into Elphael is a journey through the stages of her decay. The higher levels are still clean and white, reflecting the hope of the sanctuary. But as the player moves deeper, the water becomes stagnant and the fungus takes over. By the time we reach the bottom, we are in a swamp of concentrated rot. This is where Malenia waits. She sits at the very heart of the decay, the source of the infection. Her final resting place is a testament to the fact that her gifts were also curses. She brought life to the Halig Tree, but she also brought the rot that killed it. Elphael was meant to be a place of rebirth for the cursed, but under Malenia's influence, it became a place of stagnation. The people who lived there were trapped in a city that was falling apart. It is one of the most atmospheric locations in the game, filled with a sense of quiet, terminal melancholy. There are no grand speeches or heroic music. There is only the sound of dripping sludge and the chittering of pests. Malenia died in a world of silence, surrounded by the ruins of her brother's dream. It was a lonely, pathetic end for a woman who was once the most feared general in the world. The fact that she died in a brace is also symbolic. A brace is something used to support a broken limb. Elphael was the brace for the Halig Tree, and Malenia was the brace for her brother, but the brace was infected. By the time the player arrives, the support has failed. The tree is leaning, the city is crumbling, and the protector is asleep. Malenia's death marks the final collapse of the sanctuary. Once the blade is broken, there is nothing left to hold back the rot or the enemies of the tree. The city of Elphael is the tombstone of the age of Miquella. Ultimately, Elphael is the physical record of Malenia's life. It shows her beauty, her strength, and her inevitable decay. It is a place of high art and deep horror. Walking through its halls is like walking through Malenia's own mind. You see the gold and you see the rot. When she finally falls and becomes a flower, she becomes a permanent part of the landscape. She is the saint of a ruined city, a goddess who died in the very place she tried to save. Elphael remains as a golden, rotting monument to a woman who gave everything and was left with nothing. Part 30, Final Verdict. The Tragedy of Agency. The final verdict on Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is that she is the most tragic figure in the entire Elden Ring saga because she never truly had a choice. Her life was a series of events imposed upon her by external forces. She was cursed by an outer god at the moment of her birth. She was trained by a mysterious stranger to survive. She was manipulated by her brother to become a tool for his ambition. She was a woman of infinite martial strength, who possessed zero control over her own fate. She spent her entire life reacting to the needs and the whims of others. Her undefeated status is a hollow victory. She won every battle, but she lost the war for her own soul. She was so successful at being a blade that she stopped being a person. Her loyalty was her greatest virtue, but it was also her fatal flaw. It made her blind to her own exploitation. She committed a genocide in Caelid, not because she was evil, but because she was a good soldier. She was a victim of her own capacity for devotion. She was a warrior who could outrun the wind, but she couldn't outrun the role that Miquella had carved out for her. Even her death is not truly hers. The player kills her to progress their own story. Her third bloom may have fulfilled a prophecy she never asked for. She is a figure of infinite potential that was wasted on a childhood vow. She is a Valkyrie who died in a ditch. When we look at her whole history, we see a woman who was constantly being used. The god of Rot used her body. Miquella used her strength. The player uses her great rune. No one ever cared about what Malenia wanted, because Malenia herself forgot how to want anything for herself. She died undefeated in battle, but she was utterly defeated by life. She is the ultimate symbol of the first sin of the demigods, the belief that you can use other people as tools to fix a broken world. Marika did it, Miquella did it, and Malenia was the one who paid the price. She is a haunting, beautiful, and horrific reminder that in the lands between, power is a prison. Her golden arm and her red rot are the bars of her cell. She remains a fan-favorite character because we see our own struggles in her. We see a person trying their best in a world that has already decided their fate. Ultimately, the story of Malenia is the story of a blade that was used until it snapped. She was the sharpest weapon in the world, and she was wielded by a kind god who didn't care if she got rusty. She is the martyr of the Haligtree, a woman who gave up her continent, her army, and her soul for a dream that wasn't hers. She is a legend of speed and light, but she ended in silence and rot. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is the final proof that in the world of Elden Ring, the only thing more dangerous than a monster is a god with a vow.